Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I'm going to try and sound intelligent. I'm doing the edge of reading tag. So I used to try and do a book tag video every week, but I haven't done one for a while, which is bad. But I was tagged in this one by the creator of it, the channel Grix, etc. And it's a really, really interesting set of questions. So book tag, if you don't know, is a series of questions that booktubers kind of pass around amongst themselves. And, you know, we answer each other's questions. But this set of questions is really genuinely fascinating. And really, it's a really difficult and complex subject matter. So it's about the subject of reading and meaning, and you know what's the difference between those two things, and you know, how does interpretation come into reading, and you know what things are there out there that are reading that we don't consider to be reading. I feel like I'm making no sense at all. So let me read through the questions and you'll see what I mean. So and I would say I normally deliberately prepare for tag videos like this. I go through the questions and try and think about my answers. With this one, I very deliberately haven't done that because I think it's a tag where the questions should be answered. You know, I almost want to show my workings out loud for these questions, if that makes sense. So anyway, let's go on and talk about the first question. So the first question is: give me your own definition of reading, or use mine. So if I were to think about my definition of reading, it's taking meaning in, taking in meaning that has been laid down by somebody else, and you know, absorbing that information and interpreting it. Now, typically for me, that means stories. So for me, you know, reading is very much about stories. It's about that, you know, storytelling tradition of one person, you know, creating and recording a story, and me as a reader then reading it. But I thought Grix etc's definition of reading was really interesting, so let me read that out as well. Reading is the act of interpretation of symbols that, systematically put together in a certain sequence, allow the reader to extract meaning from them in an active form of creation that develop into complex narratives. So I think there's some really interesting stuff in there, isn't there? And I really liked the concept of the fact that the reader plays a really active part in interpreting writing into you know, into the story or the meaning. And Grix talks very much about how, you know, it's important to consider things like Braille and things like that. So, you know, his definition works for Braille. Braille is, you know, a system of symbols that have been laid down, but you don't have to take them in through your eye. You take them in through touch. So I thought that was a really interesting distinction. So I think our definitions aren't massively different, but I think his really pulls out the importance of the reader in the creation of the story. So let me move on. So given your chosen definition, I think my chosen definition is probably his definition. Are reading and interpretation the same thing? If not, in what do they differ? So I think that's a tricky question, isn't it? So I think interpretation is bigger than reading. I think there are many things you interpret which you couldn't consider to be reading. But I do think that when you read, you interpret. So you interpret the words, you interpret the meaning imparted by those words, and you put those things together to create, you know, a narrative. So I think, looking at it simply, looking at reading and interpretation, I think they are the same thing. But as I say, I think interpretation can be bigger than reading. Okay, next question. Are there any practices that you would consider reading but that wouldn't fit that or other definitions of reading? So this is really interesting, and what Grix talks about in his video is the notion of things like other forms of reading. So things like music. So, you know, laying down music on a page is something that people can then read. But he also talks about rock climbing. So he's a rock climber, and he talks about how in rock climbing you will look at a wall and you will read the wall. You know, it's called reading the wall, figuring out the different handholds and how you will climb that wall. So I think that's interesting. But then I was thinking about, you know, rock climbing. I suppose it depends. If you're climbing an artificial wall, then I can see how that's interpretation, because somebody has created that wall and has probably had ideas about ways people could climb it. Whereas if you are looking at a naturally occurring rock face, is that the same? Because you're not interpreting something that someone else has laid down. You're interpreting something that nature, randomly over centuries has created. So are there things that are reading that we wouldn't consider normally to be reading? And yeah, I think there are, and I think Grix's definition captures that. But I do think that's a really interesting question. And you think about like maps and things like that. You read a map. I really like maps. I just quite enjoy looking at maps. I think they're fascinating things. And they are also things when you think about it, and there's a question I think about this a bit later on, but they are things that, probably predate language to an extent. I suspect that people created maps for each other before there was written language, as ways of telling people which route to take and things like that. Okay, next question. Is there an ideal reading experience for you? What is it? Is there a book that represents it? And I'm not sure there is an ideal reading experience for me, other than being in a situation where I can really focus on the book and I don't have any distractions, either external distractions or internal distractions. But I enjoy the act of just staring at words on a page and taking in that meaning. But I'm not sure for me there's really an ideal experience or indeed a book that represents that. Okay, next question. If there is such a thing as an ideal reading experience, it follows that there is a scale of value to reading. What is at the bottom? So I suppose thinking about my ideal reading experience, I would probably be reading a novel. So novels are my preferred form of book. They're the thing I most enjoy reading. So for me, a well-written novel will be at the top. So what will be at the bottom? I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that question. Because I think there's lots of different ways you could cut it. You could talk about, the quality of the writing and things like that. But I'm not sure, for me, that really works in terms of an interpretation of this question. So I'm going to cheat and leave that one. Okay, is reading as the art of associating symbols and creating meaning out of them a predecessor of language, or does it come after as a consequence of these languages? So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I've touched on this already. So does writing and reading, does the creation of meaning on a page or in another way predate written language? And I'm sure it does. I'm sure, as I've said, that there were maps that people created for each other that were around before written language. When you think about cave paintings and things like that, that is a way of recording meaning so that other people can look at it and interpret it, which doesn't use written language. So I'm sure that that the act of reading, in a way, predates written language. Okay, next question. Is everything that can be read with meaning a language? And I think you're getting into real precise definitions of things here, aren't you? And I think there are things you can read which I would not consider to be a language. So I wouldn't consider maps, for example, to be a language. So I think I'm going to say no to that one. Okay, next one. Mention a few languages that defy the conventional conception of what a language is. Could a book be written in any of those languages? So Grix's answer to this one is really, really interesting. So he talks about things like music. So could you write a book entirely in music and that have meaning to somebody who could read music? Yes, I think you could. I think if you were good enough at writing music and good enough at reading music, you could write music that conveyed emotion. Even on the page without hearing the music. Now, I can't read music at all, but I can see how that would work. And similarly, another example he gives is mathematics. So could you write something purely in maths that somebody else would understand and take meaning from? Yes, I think you could. Now, would I want to read any of those books? Probably not is the answer to that. But I do think it's an interesting question. And then the final question, if you could boundlessly read, understand the meaning in one of those languages, which one would it be and why? So I think for me, it would probably be maths. So I'm not a mathematician at all. I was kind of okay at maths at school, but I don't consider, I don't have that kind of brain. My brain isn't wired in that way. But both my son and my dad are mathematicians, I would say. They are really into maths. They really understand it. and they are fascinated by it, and I am fascinated by their fascination of it. So I would be interested in being able to read maths in that kind of way, in order to understand, why their brains are so attracted to it. Okay, time for me to tag some people, because I am really interested to see how this conversation develops. I think there's some really interesting stuff here. So Grix did tag a load of people when he created the tag. There's a few people he didn't tag who I'd be interested to hear from. So I'm going to tag Brian at Bookish, MJ from Reading This Life, and Gareth from Book Songs and Other Magic. Okay, time for a random book from the shelf. So here is a book that plays around with language and writing in a really interesting way. Not, I think, to the same extent as some of the questions in that tag are getting at. But nevertheless, I thought it was a very interesting book, and that is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. I got told off in the comments the other day for calling him Mark Z. Danielewski, so I'll call him Mark Z. Danielewski, and I suspect I'm mispronouncing his surname as well. But anyway, a really interesting book, I thought, and very interestingly told, and different from many books you will have read in terms of the way it's laid out and the way it uses writing and language to tell a complex story. So I hope you found that interesting. Do let me know in the comments what you thought of the questions and of my answers. I do think this is a really fascinating subject, and I'm really interested to hear what other people have to say about it. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.